Theo Vaughn didn't stay quiet for long. After Joe Rogan went on the Joe Rogan Experience and openly discussed Theo's mental health struggles, his use of SSRIs, and a controversial situation surrounding an old Netflix taping, Theo felt the need to respond, and he did it publicly, directly, and without hesitation. Rogan, who has never been shy about speaking candidly on his podcast, brought up details about Theo's personal life that many felt should have stayed private. The mention of SSRI use alone was enough to get people talking, because that's not the kind of thing most people expect to hear discussed openly about someone without their consent, especially when that someone is a fellow comedian and a person Rogan has had a close relationship with for years. So when Theo saw what was being said, he went straight to X to address it head-on. He made it clear that what was put out there was mostly inaccurate. He expressed that it was genuinely disappointing to see that kind of information shared publicly in that way. But rather than coming in with anger or bitterness, Theo kept it grounded, stating plainly that he was doing well, and acknowledging that being a human being means life is going to have its rough patches. That's just the nature of it. Nobody gets a smooth road the entire way through. What makes this moment stand out is the fact that Theo chose to respond at all. He didn't let it sit. He didn't let someone else's version of his story become the loudest one. And the way he handled it, calm, direct, and with a sense of self-awareness, said a lot about where he actually is mentally, regardless of what was claimed about him.
For the exact same thing. And last time I was on the podcast, he was explaining it to me, and it freaks me out because I know Theo has had conversations before, like even publicly. He had a Netflix taping, and it didn't go well. It was like they shelved it. They never used it. And there was all these stories from people that were there saying he bombed. I think he just had a kind of a breakdown. And then he was talking to the crowd, and there's a video of it where he said, the people were shaking, "Hey, we still love you." He goes, "Thank you. Look, I'm trying not to take my own life. That's what I'm trying to do right now."
Yeah.
And you hear stuff like that, and you just go like, oh, Jesus Christ. I've known too many people that I didn't think were going to kill themselves and then did. And then he goes down these spirals where he starts talking about world events and freaking out. I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ. I got to help this dude. And so I send him things about people getting off of them, and apparently there's some doctors that specialize in getting people off of them. But here's the thing about that chemical imbalance thing. That's not real. They used to think that was what these things do, that they treated a chemical imbalance. But then recently, studies have shown that that is not what they do. They don't exactly know what they do. And they kind of numb you in some sort of a way that helps some people.
That response from Theo matters more than it might seem on the surface. It tells you something very specific. Theo didn't read Joe's comments as a friend simply expressing concern. He felt misrepresented. And that distinction is really at the core of this entire situation. Now, to be fair to Joe Rogan, these two men actually know each other. This isn't a case of a stranger making assumptions about someone from a distance. They've had long, deep conversations together over the years. Joe has likely seen Theo on various points in his life, through the highs and through the harder times. So if Rogan genuinely believes Theo is struggling, that concern could very well be coming from a real and honest place. But here's where the line gets crossed. The moment you take a friend's mental health and lay it out in detail on one of the most listened to podcasts on the entire planet, it is no longer a private concern. It becomes a public narrative. And that is exactly where people started raising their eyebrows at Rogan. There is a meaningful difference between quietly telling someone, "Hey, I'm worried about my friend," and sitting in front of a microphone with millions of listeners and walking through that friend's mental health history, their medication, and the lowest points of their career. One is concern, the other is exposure. And regardless of the intent behind it, the impact is the same. The person being discussed never got a say in how their story was told. That's why Theo's response carried weight. He wasn't just correcting the record, he was reclaiming his own narrative, and he had every right to do that. The SSRI discussion adds another layer of sensitivity to all of this. Rogan isn't completely off base in suggesting that the old chemical imbalance theory of depression has been oversimplified in how it's been presented to the public over the decades. That's actually a conversation happening within the scientific community as well. But acknowledging that complexity is very different from suggesting that antidepressants are ineffective, exaggerated, or something people should casually reconsider because a podcaster shared some links and raised some doubts. That is precisely where Rogan's influence starts to become a genuinely serious problem. Joe has a habit of presenting himself as just a curious person asking questions and thinking out loud, and in a smaller setting, that approach is fine. but his platform is far too large for casual medical commentary to stay casual. When Joe Rogan talks about vaccines, diet, hormones, mental health treatment, or depression, tens of millions of people receive that information, and a significant portion of them treat it as guidance, even when Rogan himself frames it as just conversation. And when the person at the center of that conversation is Theo Von, a comedian who has been remarkably open with his audience about his emotional struggles, his past addiction, and his ongoing journey, the stakes of getting it wrong become considerably higher. This isn't abstract. Real people who look up to both of these men are listening, and the way these topics get handled have consequences that extend well beyond the podcast studio.
Look, I mean, I'm having a long month. I'm trying not to take my own life, so I just want to get these photos.
I'd love to talk a little bit about shame, man, because that was a huge part of my life.
Well, tell me about it.
I just felt ashamed of myself.
Yeah.
I felt ashamed of I felt ashamed of how I looked. I felt ashamed of like my ears, my nose, my face, the way I stood. I felt, ashamed of my family, of my home. I just felt a ton of it. I'm not whining about it right now. I'm just thinking back, but yeah, I just felt a ton of shame. You know, I think I felt ashamed of who I was at like the first molecule, almost like the first cell of my, the dirt under the roots. It felt like there was a part of me that felt like I was me, or anything that had to do with me was gross.
Most of the people who pushed back in the comments weren't upset that Joe expressed concern for a friend. That part most people understood. What actually frustrated them was the fact that he chose to do it publicly, and that while doing so, he wandered into medical territory that he simply isn't qualified to speak on with any real authority. One of the most repeated criticisms in the comments section captured it well. You can be personally skeptical of antidepressants, but skepticism is not the same as expertise. And that's really the balance that needs to be struck here. Nobody is saying these conversations can't happen. People are absolutely allowed to question medication. People are allowed to discuss side effects, to push back on the pharmaceutical industry, to ask whether certain treatments are being overprescribed or misrepresented. All of that is fair game in the right context. But the moment you bring a specific person's mental health into it, by name, in public, with millions of people listening, the standard of care required goes up dramatically. And in this case, it didn't. Theo's response was brief, but it communicated everything it needed to. He didn't escalate. He didn't turn this into a full public confrontation or declare some kind of war. He simply stated that Joe had gotten it wrong, made clear that he was doing well, and reminded people that life is difficult for everyone at various points. That's just the human experience. No drama, no extended back and forth. Honestly, it was probably the most composed and effective response he could have given. He corrected the record, protected his own narrative, and walked away without feeding the cycle any more than necessary. But the larger conversation this whole situation opens up is really about Joe Rogan's position in media and culture at this point. Because Joe is no longer just a comedian sitting around with his friends, saying whatever comes to mind with no real consequences. That version of Joe Rogan doesn't exist anymore. He is now, whether he fully accepts it or not, a media institution. A single conversation on his show becomes a headline. A concern he voices becomes a public narrative. An opinion he throws out casually becomes a talking point that millions of people carry with them and repeat, particularly those who are already inclined to believe it. So when Joe Rogan sits down and talks about Theo Von's mental health, he may genuinely feel like he's speaking as a longtime friend who cares. But that is not what the audience hears. What the audience hears is an expose. And at the scale Joe operates on, the difference between those two things matters enormously.